Howard Blackwell had spent a lifetime building walls around his business, around his reputation, and most importantly, around his emotions. Control was everything. It had carried him through hostile takeovers, corporate betrayals, and competitors who would have killed, literally, to see him fall. He had mastered the art of keeping people at arm's length, of calculating every move 3 steps ahead, of ensuring that no one ever saw his weakness. But when the hospital called, all of it shattered. The moment his phone vibrated and he saw the number on the screen, something deep in his chest twisted, tight and cold. He barely heard himself answer. "This is Howard Blackwell. Mr. Blackwell, your son Logan has been admitted to the ER. He's asking for you." There were very few things in the world that could make Howard feel fear. This was one of them. The file on his desk, the one he had been analyzing for the last 2 hours, was forgotten. The whiskey glass he had poured earlier remained untouched. He was already on his feet, grabbing his keys, the sound of his own heartbeat drowning out whatever else the nurse was saying on the phone. Logan. His son. His only son. "I'm on my way." Howard hated hospitals. They smelled like sickness and loss, like memories he refused to acknowledge. The sharp scent of antiseptic clung to his clothes as he walked past the nurse's station, his strides purposeful, urgent. He had no time for pleasantries. No patience for the quiet murmurs of strangers. All that mattered was Logan. When he stepped into the hospital room, his stomach lurched, something rare, something foreign. Logan sat on the edge of the bed, looking smaller than Howard had ever seen him. His left arm was in a cast, his lip split, and there was an ugly bruise spreading across his cheekbone. He looked like someone had beaten the life out of him, and Howard felt something in his chest tighten to the point of pain. His son had never been weak. He had always been sharp, confident, a fighter. But right now, he just looked tired. "Dad." The word was hoarse, almost an exhale. Howard crossed the room in 2 strides, kneeling beside him. He placed a firm, steadying hand on Logan's good shoulder, a silent promise. "I'm here." For a long moment, Logan didn't speak. His jaw clenched, his fingers curling into the hospital sheets. And then, finally, he whispered, "I saw Mom." Howard stilled. His grip on Logan's shoulder tightened, though his face remained unreadable. But Logan wasn't looking at his father. His eyes were fixed on a crack in the wall, unfocused, distant, like he was seeing something he couldn't unsee. She was with Derek. His voice was barely above a whisper. "In your bedroom." The world tilted. Howard felt the ground shift beneath him, but his years of discipline, of control, held him steady, kept him from reacting. Because that was the only thing keeping him upright right now. "I wasn't trying to spy," Logan continued. His voice was detached, bitter. I came home to grab my laptop. I heard them talking, laughing." His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. "So I went to check." Howard inhaled slowly. He didn't ask what he saw. He didn't need to. The rage inside him, cold, lethal, patient, was already beginning to coil. But Logan wasn't finished. "I pulled out my phone to call you," he said. "That's when Derek saw me." Howard's fingers twitched. His free hand curled into a fist at his side. Logan let out a bitter laugh, but it was hollow. He was drunk. At least, I think he was. "He came at me, yelling, trying to take my phone." His voice wavered slightly, but then he clenched his jaw. "We fought. I shoved him back, but then," he exhaled sharply, "he slammed me into the doorframe." Howard didn't move. He didn't blink. But if anyone had looked closely, they would have seen the slight shift in his breathing. The way his entire body had gone still. A long pause stretched between them. And then, Logan said the words that broke something inside Howard completely. The worst part wasn't him. Logan looked up then, searching his father's face, needing him to understand. The worst part was Mom. Howard's throat was dry. He forced himself to speak. "What did she do?" Logan laughed again, but it was humorless. Defeated. She didn't stop him. His eyes shone, not with tears, but with something darker. "She told him to lock me in the guest room." Howard closed his eyes for a brief second. The emotion in Logan's voice was so raw, so undeniably real, that something inside Howard cracked. She had betrayed him, not just as a husband, but as a father. A long, suffocating silence settled between them. Finally, Howard opened his eyes, his expression unreadable. "You're safe now." Logan let out a breath. He nodded, but there was something in his gaze, something heavy. They both knew the truth. Nothing was safe anymore. By the time Howard pulled up to the house, the storm inside him had settled. Not into rage. Rage was reckless. Rage made mistakes. This was something colder. Something deadly. The house stood dark and silent. a graveyard of 20 years of deception. Inside, the evidence of Victoria's hasty departure was everywhere. Empty drawers, clothes missing, an emptied safe. This wasn't an affair. This was a heist. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Without checking the caller ID, he answered. Robert. The familiar voice of Robert Kane, his attorney, his closest confidant, came through. Tell me how bad it is. Howard exhaled. His eyes swept the room, taking in the remnants of a life that no longer existed. They didn't just betray me, Robert. His voice was quiet, dangerous, final. They stole from me. There was a pause. Then, Robert's voice, steady and knowing. What do you need? Howard turned toward the window. His reflection stared back at him, a man who had nothing left to lose. I need to know everything. His voice was ice. Where they are. What they took. Who else is involved. Another beat of silence. Then, I'll get you what you need. Howard ended the call and let the quiet settle around him. Victoria had taken everything from him. Now, it was his turn to take everything back. Howard Blackwell sat in his darkened office, staring at the untouched glass of whiskey on his desk. His fingers twitched, itching to pick it up, to throw it, to hear it shatter against the wall. But what would be the point? A broken glass wouldn't undo anything. Wouldn't erase the image of Logan, sitting on that hospital bed, looking up at him with complete, gut-wrenching trust. Mom told him to lock me in the guest room. Howard squeezed his eyes shut. Christ. His boy. The same boy he had carried on his shoulders through the park, who used to fall asleep in his lap while he worked late into the night. The boy who had his sharp mind and Victoria's smile, before she turned into a stranger. Logan had been hurt. In their home. And the woman who had sworn to love him, the woman Howard had spent half his life believing in, had stood there and let it happen. Howard had been betrayed before. He knew what that felt like. The slow, creeping realization. The moment where trust unraveled like a thread pulled too hard. But this was something else. He forced himself to exhale slowly, fingers pressing into his temples. He couldn't afford to lose himself in anger. He had been too emotional already, and look where that had gotten him. Victoria hadn't just betrayed him. She had outmaneuvered him. That alone made his stomach turn. He had spent decades building an empire, mastering strategy, knowing how to see 3 moves ahead before anyone even knew they were in a game. And she had played him like a fool. His fingers hovered over his phone for a second before he made the call. Robert Kane picked up immediately. Tell me how bad it is. Howard swallowed back the bitterness in his throat. She emptied the safe. He forced his voice to stay calm. Even. Cash, personal files, everything. A pause. She planned this. Howard let out a breath. For a long time. Robert's voice was steady, controlled. What do you need me to do? Howard clenched his jaw. Freeze everything. My personal assets. Every fund she had access to. I don't care if it slows business down, lock it all down. Robert was silent for a moment. You sure about this? She made her choice, Howard said. That was the only answer he had. The only answer that mattered. Robert sighed. I'll get it done. Howard hung up and leaned forward, rubbing a hand down his face. His whole body felt tense, rigid. His mind was racing, but it was too quiet in here. He had spent the last 20 years thinking this house was his, thinking it was a place where he was safe, where his family was safe. Now, it felt like nothing more than a crime scene. The bed where he had slept beside her for years was still messy from their last night together. His closet, half empty, the perfume she used to wear still faintly lingering in the air. His gaze drifted to the nightstand. Her wedding ring was gone. Good. His phone rang again. Miles Harrington. Howard didn't bother with a greeting. How bad? Miles let out a slow breath. Howard, they took millions. The words hit like a punch to the ribs. It started small, just enough to go unnoticed. But the last 48 hours? They took as much as they could get their hands on. Howard leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling. The anger was there, but it wasn't hot. It was cold. Calculated. Dangerous. How? Miles hesitated. That alone told Howard everything. The transactions were made using your credentials. Silence. Howard closed his eyes. He should have seen this coming. They weren't just stealing from him. They were setting him up. They're coming after you, Howard, Miles said. If this goes public. It won't. But even as he said it, Howard knew it was a lie. Victoria hadn't just left. She hadn't just betrayed him. She had made sure that when this was over, he would be the one to take the fall. His grip on his phone tightened. Find me proof, he said. I want to know exactly where the money went, when it moved, and who else is involved. I'm already working on it. Howard ended the call and exhaled slowly. He couldn't afford to think about the why right now. He couldn't afford to ask himself whether she had ever actually loved him or if it had all been a lie. It didn't matter. The only thing that mattered now was stopping them before they did any more damage. His phone buzzed again. Unknown number. Howard clicked it open. Back off, Blackwell, or everything you've built will burn. Howard's jaw clenched. They think they can scare me. He typed back. You already made a mistake. Now you're just making it worse. The response came almost instantly. Tick-tock. His grip on the phone tightened. They weren't just stealing from him. They were watching him. His mind raced. Who had access to his private communication lines? Miles. Robert. Celeste. Logan. Not Logan. It couldn't be Logan. Howard pushed himself to his feet, grabbing his coat as he dialed Robert again. We found them, Robert said before Howard could speak. Where? An abandoned property outside the city. Vaughn owns it under a shell company. It's remote, isolated. If they're hiding, that's where they are. Howard grabbed his keys. Send me the address. Robert hesitated. You should wait. If this is bigger than just them. I'm not waiting. His wife had stolen from him. His company was under attack, and someone was watching his every move. The time for caution was over. Now, it was time to strike first. Howard drove through the night, his grip on the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. The city lights blurred past him, distant and meaningless. His mind was elsewhere, at the edge of a knife, where betrayal and fury met. Victoria had always been the kind of woman who played her cards close to her chest. She had been smart, calculated. He had admired that about her once. But this was more than just betrayal. She had taken from him. She had hurt their son. And now she thought she could run. The GPS guided him toward the outskirts of the city, where the skyline gave way to empty roads and abandoned buildings. The property Robert had found was miles away from prying eyes. Vaughn had chosen his hideout well, but not well enough. Howard parked a few blocks away, stepping out into the cool night air. He could hear the distant hum of crickets, the wind rustling through the trees. The world was quiet here, too quiet. He adjusted the cuffs of his jacket, inhaling deeply. He wasn't here to talk. He was here to end this. The warehouse loomed in the darkness, rusted metal and shattered windows giving it an eerie, forgotten look. But Howard knew better. Victoria and Vaughn were inside. Waiting. Planning. He approached carefully, his footsteps silent against the pavement. A single car was parked near the entrance, Vaughn's. Howard recognized the vanity plate, some ridiculous attempt at bravado. The kind of thing a man like him would find amusing. Howard resisted the urge to key the damn thing on his way past. Instead, he moved to the side of the building, pressing against the cold steel. He could hear voices inside, low, hushed. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind remained sharp. They were talking about him. He's not going to just let this go, Victoria's voice carried through the thin walls. Howard closed his eyes for half a second, willing himself to breathe. The sound of her voice should have hurt. It didn't. It only fueled the fire. Vaughn laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. He's got no choice. The money's moved. The documents are out. He's already lost. Howard smirked. Amateurs. They thought they had one. They had no idea what was coming. He moved toward the back entrance, careful, deliberate. The door was locked, but locks had never been much of an obstacle for him. A few seconds later, he was inside. The warehouse smelled of dust and stale air. The glow of a single overhead bulb illuminated a table in the center of the room, where Victoria and Vaughn sat across from each other. Laptops open, papers scattered, planning their next move. Howard stepped forward, his presence filling the space before his voice even cut through the silence. Going somewhere? Victoria's head snapped up first, her eyes widening. Vaughn was slower, his cocky grin slipping for half a second before he covered it with bravado. Howard, Vaughn drawled, leaning back in his chair. Didn't expect to see you here. Howard ignored him. His gaze was locked onto her. Victoria met his stare, something unreadable in her expression. For a moment, it was like time stretched between them, 20 years of memories, of whispered promises, of shared victories and losses. And then it was gone. You shouldn't have come, she said quietly. Howard tilted his head. Why? Because you were hoping to be long gone before I caught up? Vaughn chuckled, shaking his head. Come on, Blackwell. You're too smart for this. You can't win. Howard smiled, but there was nothing warm in it. You've already made one mistake, Vaughn. Don't make another. Vaughn rolled his eyes. Jesus, you're predictable. You think because you walked in here, you have control? You have nothing left, Howard. We took your money. Your reputation is next. Howard didn't blink. You're still talking like I haven't already won. Vaughn scoffed. Won? You're drowning, man. Howard reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, tapping the screen a few times before turning it toward them. A live feed from his office appeared. Miles sitting at a desk, going through files, speaking into a headset. Vaughn frowned. What the hell is this? Howard's voice was calm, controlled, lethal. This is my team undoing every single move you've made, he said. You thought you were smart, Vaughn. But you got sloppy. Victoria's face remained impassive, but Howard saw the way her hands clenched into fists in her lap. You didn't think I'd have a backup, did you? Howard continued. You didn't think I'd be 3 steps ahead, the way I've always been. Vaughn was trying to hide it, but Howard could see the way the confidence was slipping. You're bluffing, Vaughn said. But there was doubt in his voice now. Howard smiled. Try me. Victoria inhaled sharply, finally speaking. You don't have to do this, Howard. Howard turned to her. Something sharp twisted in his chest. Not pain. Disgust. You stood there and let him hurt Logan, he said. There's nothing left to say. Victoria flinched, just for a second. And Howard realized something in that moment. She had convinced herself that this was just business, that he wouldn't make it personal. She had forgotten who he was. Howard took a step closer. Vaughn tensed, his hand hovering near his waistband. Howard sighed. I wouldn't. Vaughn hesitated, then let out a nervous laugh. Jesus, Blackwell. You always were a cold son of a bitch. Howard didn't respond. He simply turned his gaze back to Victoria. You made your choice, he said quietly. Now live with it. Victoria's jaw tightened. And what happens now? Howard stepped back, sliding his phone into his pocket. Now. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Now, you watch everything you stole fall apart. Vaughn opened his mouth to argue, but before he could, Howard was already walking toward the door. He didn't look back. Victoria had made her bed. Now, she had to lie in it. Howard Blackwell had spent his entire life preparing for war. He had fought through corporate betrayals, dismantled enemies who had tried to steal from him, crushed men who thought they could outmaneuver him. He had never lost. But sitting alone in his penthouse, staring at the untouched glass of whiskey on the counter, he finally admitted something to himself. This wasn't like before. This wasn't just business. This was his son. This was his family. And somehow, despite all of his wealth, all of his power, he hadn't seen it coming. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. The exhaustion settled in his chest like a heavy stone. He wasn't the kind of man who let himself feel weakness, but tonight, he felt something close to it. Not because of the money, not because of the company, but because Logan had been hurt, and Howard hadn't been there to stop it. That failure burned deeper than anything. A knock at the door cut through his thoughts. He stiffened immediately. It was late. No one should be here. His mind raced through the possibilities, a hit, a warning, another move in this game that was quickly turning into a war. He moved toward the door carefully, his body tense. He unlocked it in one swift motion, pulling it open, and exhaled. Logan stood there. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Howard just took in the sight of him, his bruised face, the stiffness in his movements, the way he carried himself differently now. Something had shifted. Howard stepped aside without a word. Logan walked in, glancing around the apartment. He had been here before, of course, but tonight, he looked at it like he was seeing it for the first time. Howard closed the door and turned to face him. You should be resting. Logan let out a short laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, probably. Silence settled between them. It was strange. There had been a time when conversation between them had been easy, effortless. Now, it felt like neither of them knew where to start. Finally, Logan spoke. I know you're going after them. Howard didn't deny it. I need to help. Howard's jaw tightened. He had expected this. But hearing it out loud? It was different. You need to focus on healing, Howard said carefully. I am. Logan's voice was steady. Too steady. That's why I need to do this. Howard sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Logan. They tried to destroy you, Logan interrupted. They tried to destroy us. And I can't just sit back and do nothing. Howard looked at him, really looked at him. And for the first time, he didn't just see his son. He saw a man who had been hurt, a man who had been betrayed by someone he loved, a man who wanted to fight. Howard wasn't sure if that made him proud or if it scared the hell out of him. You don't need to do this, Howard said quietly. Logan's jaw clenched. Neither do you. But you're still going to. Howard exhaled slowly. God, he's just like me. He hated that. This isn't your fight. Howard tried again. Logan took a step closer. They made it my fight when they locked me in that room. Howard's breath caught in his throat. He had spent his entire life protecting Logan from the world he lived in, the betrayals, the power plays, the violence. And now, Logan had been dragged into it anyway. That realization hit him like a punch to the ribs. After a long moment, Howard nodded. All right, he said quietly. Logan's shoulders relaxed just a little. But you follow my lead, Howard continued. No reckless decisions. No unnecessary risks. Logan smirked slightly. Sounds like you're describing yourself. Howard let out a short laugh before shaking his head. This is serious, Logan. I know. Howard studied him for a moment longer. Then, finally, he reached forward, placing a firm hand on his son's uninjured shoulder. We end this, Howard said. Logan nodded. We end this. Howard squeezed his shoulder once before stepping back. Logan had already been hurt once. Howard wouldn't let it happen again. Victoria and Vaughn had made their move. Now, it was time for him to make his. Howard had spent his entire life winning. Every battle, every deal, every moment that required him to outthink and outmaneuver someone, he won. But this time, he had almost lost everything. His wife had betrayed him. His company had been attacked. His own son had been hurt. And that was the one thing Howard couldn't stomach. Not the money. Not the empire. Logan. Howard had spent years making sure his son never had to fight the kinds of wars he fought every day. He had built a wall between his personal life and the ruthless world he operated in. And still, Victoria had found a way to rip that wall down. She had let Vaughn put his hands on Logan. And Howard hadn't been there to stop it. That was what ate at him the most. Not the betrayal. Not even the theft. But the fact that when his son had needed him most, he wasn't there. Howard sat in his office, rubbing his hands over his face, his elbows resting on his desk. The exhaustion pressed against his ribs, heavier than anything he had ever carried. He had spent his entire life knowing exactly what to do next. Now, for the first time in decades, he hesitated. A knock at the door broke the silence. He didn't even have to look up. Come in, Logan. His son stepped inside. Howard studied him carefully. His posture, the way he moved, the way he held his shoulders too stiff, like he was trying to hide how much he was still in pain. Shouldn't you be resting? Howard asked quietly. Logan let out a small, humorless laugh. That's what you always say. Howard exhaled, leaning back in his chair. Because it's true. Logan walked closer, stopping on the other side of the desk. He didn't sit. His hands curled into fists at his sides. You're going after them. Howard didn't deny it. Logan took a breath. I want to help. Howard's jaw tightened. No. Logan didn't flinch. Dad, I said no. Howard's voice was firm. Final. Logan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You can't protect me forever. Howard's hands clenched into fists. Watch me. Logan's lips pressed into a thin line. They came after me too. I know that. Howard stood abruptly, rounding the desk until he was standing face to face with his son. His eyes burned with something raw. You think I don't know that? You think I haven't spent every second since that hospital picturing what could have happened if you weren't strong enough to fight back? Logan swallowed hard. Howard exhaled slowly, shaking his head. You are my son, and that means no one gets to hurt you and walk away from it. Logan's eyes flickered with something. Understanding. But he didn't back down. You can't do this alone. Howard sighed. He knew that. He just hated the idea of Logan being involved in any of it. But his son wasn't a boy anymore. He wasn't someone Howard could just shield from the world. Howard sat back down, rubbing his temples. You follow my lead. Logan nodded, his jaw set. No reckless decisions, Howard continued. No unnecessary risks. Logan gave him a half smirk. Sounds like you're describing yourself. Howard huffed out something close to a laugh. This isn't a joke, Logan. I know. Howard studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. We end this. Logan nodded back. We end this. Howard exhaled slowly, standing again. Victoria and Vaughn had made their move. Now, it was time for him to make his. The abandoned property sat on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by nothing but dead grass and rusting metal. Howard parked a few blocks away, stepping out of the car. The air was crisp, biting against his skin. The world was quiet here, too quiet. He wasn't armed. He didn't need to be. He wasn't here to fight. He was here to end this. Howard moved through the shadows, his steps silent. He could hear voices inside, low, hushed. Victoria's voice. He closed his eyes for half a second. Then he kept moving. The warehouse door was slightly ajar. Howard slipped inside, his breath slow and measured. He didn't need to see them to know they were there. Going somewhere. Victoria's head snapped up first. Vaughn turned slower, a smirk already forming on his lips. Well, Vaughn said, leaning back in his chair. Look who finally caught up. Howard ignored him. His gaze locked onto her. Victoria. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, she exhaled. You shouldn't be here. Howard tilted his head. Why? Because you were hoping to disappear before I found you. Victoria didn't answer. Vaughn chuckled. You're not looking so good, Blackwell. Howard turned to him. You think this is funny? Howard's voice was calm. Too calm. Vaughn smirked. I think you've already lost. Howard smiled. You always were an idiot. Vaughn's expression flickered. Excuse me. Howard reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. I already won. He turned the screen toward them. A live feed from an FBI office. Vaughn's face drained of color. Howard's voice was steady. You should have been more careful with your offshore accounts. Victoria's hands curled into fists. Vaughn opened his mouth, but no words came out. You're done, Howard said simply. Vaughn ran. Howard didn't stop him. Because he didn't have to. A second later, black SUVs pulled up outside, doors flying open. FBI agents. Howard stepped back, watching as they tackled Vaughn to the ground. The other man screamed something incoherent, but Howard wasn't listening. Because Victoria was still standing there. She wasn't running. She wasn't fighting. She was just looking at him. Howard exhaled. You made your choice, he said quietly. Victoria lifted her chin. And so did you. Howard studied her. For a brief second, just a second, he thought about the life they had built. The love that had once been real. The family they had once been. Then he turned and walked away. Victoria had made her bed. Now, she had to lie in it. Howard Blackwell stood outside the warehouse, his breath steady, his heart pounding in his chest. The flashing red and blue lights from the FBI vehicles cast long shadows across the cracked pavement. Vaughn was already in cuffs, struggling, shouting threats that meant nothing. Howard barely heard him. Victoria hadn't moved. She stood in the doorway of the warehouse, arms crossed, her face unreadable. For years, he had known every detail of her expressions, every flicker of emotion behind her carefully constructed mask. But tonight, he couldn't read her. That should have made him feel something. But there was nothing left. No anger. No sorrow. No relief. Just emptiness. A familiar voice broke through the haze. Robert Kane stepped up beside him, hands in his pockets. You did it. Howard exhaled, tilting his head slightly. Did I? Robert gave him a sharp look. Vaughn's going away for a long time. The accounts are frozen. The damage to Blackwell Dynamics is contained. He paused. And she's out of your life. Howard's jaw clenched. Victoria wasn't in cuffs. Not yet. The evidence against Vaughn had been airtight. The fraud, the offshore transfers, it all led back to him. But Victoria? She had been careful. And Howard knew she wouldn't go down unless he made the final move. A younger version of himself would have done it without hesitation. But now, as he looked at the woman he had once built a life with, he hesitated. You have the power to ruin her, Robert said. Just say the word. Howard's fingers twitched. The world had always been simple before. People were either with him or against him. And if they were against him, he destroyed them. But Victoria had been so much more than just an enemy. For 20 years, she had been his partner, his wife, the mother of his child. Even now, knowing what she had done, knowing how deeply she had betrayed him, he couldn't shake the memories. The way she used to laugh in the mornings, hair still messy from sleep. The way she used to trace circles on his palm when she thought he wasn't paying attention. Had it all been a lie? Or had something real existed before it all fell apart? Victoria held his gaze, her lips parting slightly as if she was about to say something. But Howard spoke first. You had everything, he said, his voice low. She swallowed. So did you. Howard exhaled. He wasn't going to get answers. Not the ones he wanted. And maybe that was the real punishment. Not destroying her. Forgetting her. He turned to Robert. Let her go. Robert blinked. You're sure? Howard nodded once. Victoria's expression didn't change. She just let out a slow breath and gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then she turned and walked into the night. And just like that, she was gone. Logan was waiting for him when he got home. He was sitting on the couch, one leg bouncing anxiously. The moment Howard stepped inside, his son stood, searching his face for answers. Is it over? Howard exhaled. It's over. Logan studied him for a second, then nodded. But he didn't sit back down. Howard knew why. Because even though the battle was over, nothing about this felt like a victory. He poured himself a drink, then hesitated. His fingers lingered on the rim of the glass. Then, slowly, he set it back down. She's not going to prison, is she? Logan's voice was quiet. Howard turned to face him. No. Logan exhaled sharply. Why? Howard leaned against the counter. Because I don't need to waste any more of my life thinking about her. Logan's gaze flickered with something understanding. Maybe. Or maybe just exhaustion. I don't think I'll ever forgive her, Logan admitted. Howard studied him. You don't have to be sad. Logan nodded. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Logan stepped forward, hesitating for just a second before pulling his father into a brief, firm hug. Howard closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, just long enough to let himself feel it. When Logan pulled away, his posture was lighter. What now? Logan asked. Howard exhaled. Now. He glanced out the window, at the city that was still his. Now we rebuild.